Well, it is an honor to be invited here and to have so many people turn up at this auditorium, filling it up. And this is where I grew up. This is my old stomping grounds. So it's fun. Sometimes a little bittersweet, but anyway, it's fun to be back in general at Stanford. And it's also, by the way, where Gödel Escher Bach was not totally written, because I wrote two drafts of it in Oregon when I was a graduate student. But then when I came down here, I spent another 2 years working extremely hard at Pat Suppi's Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences in Ventura Hall, which was then moved physically about a quarter of a mile somewhere else, and it still exists. Anyway, so I like to improvise to some extent. Today I have a bunch of notes, which is a little different from how I often do, but I think the notes will help me organize myself. My title was The Nature of Categories and Concepts, and I do want to try to broaden your notion of what these things are. Not that I know what your notion is, but I have a general sense as to how they're used, and I think that they're used in ways that don't represent enough flexibility, and because to me, the action of categorization is at the core of cognition in an interesting way that I hope to convey to you today. I think that cognitive science has been very influenced over the decades, not only cognitive science, but philosophy of mind, linguistics, perhaps psychology, cognitive psychology as well, by ideas that were inherited from mathematical logic, even mathematical logic of the late 19th century. And I think that mathematical logic puts truth and reasoning and such things in the driver's seat or in first place. And I think that that's very inappropriate for thinking about the nature of thinking. But it leaves, I don't know how to say it exactly, there are residues everywhere throughout cognitive science. You'll find people, for example, using the predicate calculus to represent ideas, and that's one example. People use words that come from mathematical logic, even if those words have somewhat changed in their connotations or in what they mean. So I'm hoping to show you that there are lots of things that you may not have considered to be categories that I think merit that title. I would say, first of all, that categories, as we know from people like Wittgenstein and also Eleanor Roche, are things that do not admit of yes and no membership, exact yes and no answers to questions, is this a member of that category or not? But there are things that can be considered very strong central members, things that can be considered peripheral members, things that can be considered maybe marginally outside a category, and so forth. And I think that's this sense of gradation or graded membership is terribly important. Another thing that I want to get across in the lecture is that I will probably say, I may use a term like member of a category because it's very tempting and so forth, but you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. If I say that, I mean probably a very strong member of a category or something like that, because it's clear that things can be very dubious members of categories as well. Categories often are labeled by words, and I think that everybody is obviously familiar with sort of the most obvious ones that pop to mind, things like book or chair or table. or bird, or something like that. In other words, things that seem to be out there in the world, that seem to be physical objects, and you say, oh, is this thing a member of the category book? And like this, is that a member of the category book? Is this a member of the category book? And so forth. But there are, I would like to say that there are categories that are linguistically named, but that are not just single words. They are phrases, or they are even longer things than phrases, whole sentences, or long, very long phrases, and I will give a number of examples of those. Okay. Another thing that I'm going to say, I'm just giving you a kind of a prelude or a foretaste of what I'm going to jump into in a moment, is that categorization and categories themselves are very intimately related to analogy making. And this is one of my theme songs that, in fact, I gave a lecture here at Stanford in 2006, presidential lecture called Analogy as the Core of Cognition. And what I'm saying today will be very similar to what I said then, but it will have a number of different examples and perhaps some different points of emphasis. So categories usually begin as a sort of a singleton, and I'll give examples of this, and then they blur or spread outwards by a process of analogy making. Sometimes I could refer to it as pluralization, when something that's a singular becomes a plural. And another thing which maybe is more obvious with categorization than it is with analogy making is that it happens all the time, many times per second. When I talk about analogy, I often begin by saying analogy happens many times per second, as opposed to being something that happens, or that is sort of analogies are not just tools for sophisticated reasoners that are reeled out in special circumstances once every week or once every month or something like that, that analogy making is happening many, many times per second. By the way, this phrase, many, many times per second, it's clear that if you ask me how many times, I would not say exactly 10 or exactly 11 times per second. And even if you said in the last second, in just this last second, how many analogies did you make, I would instantly say that's a meaningless question. And it's tied in with a sort of a thesis that I have, that I state humorously, but that I state seriously at the same time, which is you can't count anything. And what do I mean by that? I mean that well-meaning people often ask questions that sound very sensible, but that when you look at them carefully make no or very little sense. I mean, they clearly have an idea in their mind. The idea is not completely vacuous, but trying to attach numbers often doesn't make any sense. People will say to me, for example, how many languages do you speak? And I'm always caught off guard, and a long time ago I came up with a humorous answer. To answer it, I say, I'm bilingual, where pi is 3.14, blah, blah, blah. And what I mean by that is, I don't really, firstly, it would be rather humorous if I'd meant it literally, if I meant, I have a transcendental number, it's an irrational number of languages, and I could tell you the millionth decimal place. Obviously, I don't mean that. I mean, perhaps something like, well, if you were to add them all up, and they all come in different sort of blurry fractions, you might get something around 3. So, various languages that I've studied at different levels, that I've achieved at different times. I've mastery at high at one time, very low at another time. It's all very, very hard to quantify, and it's kind of meaningless. And the question is well meant, but I always kind of don't know how to answer it whatsoever. Because I've always loved languages, and I've studied lots of them. And I studied a language like Tamil, about 50 years ago, and I probably learned about 5 words. How do you count? How do you count that? How much of a native speaker of Tamil am I at that point? 0.000000001, something like that. I mean, it's. So how do you add up these fractions? Anyway, it's very meaningless. So another thing is that what is a language? You can't say what a language is, even if you you agreed that counting how many of them I speak is blurry. What even counts as a language is extremely blurry. I mean, Dutch, if it weren't for political history, could be considered a dialect of German. That many languages spoken in China wouldn't be called dialects. It's just a historical thing that they're called dialects. And one could go on and on in saying things like that. So it's very important to realize that these questions about categories are extremely graded and blurry. Okay. I should talk about some nouns. I did already. That is, a language is an example of a noun that is what one might normally consider a category. And I've already tried to show that that's a very blurry thing. But I'd like to extend the notion of category membership to talk about categories that are attached, that have linguistic labels, but the labels are not nouns. I don't know how many people think of categories in that way, but over the past 20, 30 years, I've certainly come to thinking of categories in that way myself. And so I'd like to evoke some examples for you to suggest. Let's begin with verbs. So I've, in this book, by the way, which has two authors, not one, although you can't count anything. Emmanuel Sonder is my co-author, equal co-author. I just wanted to mention that. It's very important to me that we both be counted there. We give lots of examples of children's use of verbs, very young children's use of verbs, and how they label situations in interesting ways, which are very understandable, but which might sound like mistakes, but which we argue are not really mistakes. So let me take an example. Little girl said, "I undressed the banana." Now, that's a wonderful example of a situation that evokes the word or the verb to undress. It evoked it spontaneously. You know, if she had known the verb peel, perhaps that would have, then you could say that undress is perhaps an accident. Although, of course, once again, you can't count anything, and to say whether she knows or doesn't know the word peel is a very blurry thing in itself. She might have heard it once or twice, or some indeterminate number, around one or two. She might have even used it once or twice. But what does it mean to know a word? I mean, she might know the word undress far better than she knows the word to peel. My point is simply that when there is a label that's very available in her vocabulary and that seems to match the situation in a very reasonable way, I don't think it's reasonable to call it an error. Even if in her vocabulary there is sort of on the fringes another word that might be considered by native speakers, adult native speakers, to be a little bit more appropriate. My son at age 5, his first sentence at school in Italian was, "I want to eat some water." I mean, in English he wouldn't have said that, but he didn't know enough Italian to say bere, he said mangiare. And so, "I want to eat some water." It was, in a certain sense, it was an error. In another sense, he blurted it out very spontaneously, and he may not have even thought about whether he was groping for a word that he didn't know. He probably just blurted it out. Children ask things like, "Do buses eat gas?" My co-author, Emmanuel's daughter, once asked her mother after there was a party in their apartment building upstairs, and they had made a lot of noise, and her mother was very annoyed at the neighbors. Talia woke up and she said, "Are you going to scold the neighbors today?" And it's a blurry sort of fringe usage of scold. And on and on. I have lots of other examples, but I don't want to get too bogged down in examples. My point is that each of these cases of evocation of a verb was, to my mind, showing that the situation which is a very large, say, a party that takes place in the evening involving a bunch of people who live in the same apartment building, who are seen to be doing something that's somewhat annoying to a parent figure, and all of that gets perceived as one situation, and it evokes the word scold. And so it's a member for Talia, it was a member of the category to scold. So I'm only trying to suggest that verbs are the names of categories, and that's not just nouns. They're very hard to define, though. I mean, anybody who has tried to learn a foreign language knows how often, not only with verbs, with all words, but in this case, just talking about verbs, how hard it is to select the right verb for a certain circumstance. My wife, who is Chinese, has the hardest time figuring out what verb to use to apply to movies. And it's interesting because maybe I thought about it, but it really became very apparent that she was struggling. Have you seen this movie? Have you looked at this movie? Have you watched this movie? And I had a hard time figuring out which was the right one. I still do occasionally. I know that I'll come out saying things spontaneously without thinking about them, and I'll choose a native speaker verb. I know you can say, "I've seen that movie." I'm not sure if I would say I've looked at that movie, and I don't think I would. I might say I've watched that movie. Let's watch a movie tonight. I think we could say that. So it shows that the kinds of circumstances that evoke the choice of a particular category are extremely subtle. And of course, in Chinese, when I try to speak Chinese, I have a rough time figuring out what verb to use to say to see, or what verb to use to say to read, or what verb to use to say almost anything, frankly, in Chinese. It's very, very difficult. Let's take the verb to fall. I can give you I wrote down about 7 different verbs that mean to fall in Chinese. I can name them quickly for people who are interested. Luo, jiang, jiao, xia, shuai, die, dao. All of those are different ways of saying to fall. Some of them might apply to leaves falling off of a tree. Some might apply to prices or things in the stock market falling. Some might apply to something falling out off of a surface onto a lower surface. Some might apply to toppling over like a building. Some might apply to a person falling down, and on and on. And learning exactly which of these verbs to use in which circumstance is extremely difficult. So that it seems to me to fall is a very obvious notion. But when I try to say it in Chinese, it's not obvious at all. And it's because the categories that language provides to its speakers are carved up in a very subtle way. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say that there are precise boundaries and you're either right or wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I am trying to say that native speakers will on occasion say, no, you can't say that. Or this would be a good word to use in this situation, or that one would be a good one to use in that situation. I'm not trying to say that the boundaries are precise. I'm just trying to say that they're elusive. The nature of these blurry halos is very subtle. So now let's move on to some other categories. A set of categories that I think is interesting is conjunctions. You might never think of a conjunction as being the name of a category. But in order to get us into the right frame of mind, I'd like to suggest a category or a conjunction that is a fairly recent one. I believe it probably didn't exist 50 years ago or maybe 60 years ago, I don't know. That is the category slash. You say something slash something. So I have a few examples here, some of which, by the way, I just made up today, one of which I heard today when Adam Katzeff, who was in this audience, used it. So I quickly copied it down, and I'll begin with that example. He said, how do these compare with your files/prints? And these images, that is, how do these images compare with your files/prints? And so I asked him why he said slash, and what did he mean? What does this thing mean? And he thought about it, and he said, well, it's kind of like and, but it's a little bit, they're really this, I don't want to separate and say that they're two different things. They're really sort of the same thing. They're one thing. They're combined together. And so I thought, okay, that's possibly part of the answer. I mean, a native speaker doesn't always know why they choose what they say. It comes out spontaneously. Where does it come from? Well, from analogy making. It comes from this situation is like other situations that I've heard people use the word slash in. That's where it comes from. And we don't know how our analogy making facility works unconsciously. So I wrote some others down. I made some up. Say an electron is a wave/particle. Maybe. Now why is that so funny? Another one. She's a bimbo/self-marketing genius. Now here's one I really heard. Those I made up, but here's one I heard the other. Here's one I heard the other day. It's just some random conversation. The woman said, "I make a really good avocado dip/salsa," and so I can read you some others. Downton Abbey is a period piece/soap opera. He's an athlete/entrepreneur. All of these maybe, I don't know. I mean, those ones I made up. So I don't know. I mean, I'm a native speaker, but I didn't blurt them out. I was consciously trying to make them up. So I can't claim that these are really good usages. But my point is that if you open your ears, you'll hear slash a lot. I mean, you've already heard it. But I mean, open your ears and send me emails if you hear slash. I may be overwhelmed, but I'd love to get a collection of slash usages because it's interesting. It's a new conjunction, and it defines a certain set of situations, and those situations are recognized by analogy to other situations that native speakers use that have evoked that word in the native speech of native speakers. And it's a very subtle thing. Now, not only new conjunctions, but old conjunctions are the names of categories. So one of my favorites is the word but. And I will say that this is one of those cases where mathematical logic had a bad effect on me. I remember maybe 50 years ago, maybe more, maybe 55, well, not quite, but anyway, 53, 54 years ago, I was a big aficionado of mathematical logic, and I was buying math logic books all the time, trying to learn from them. And, of course, one of the first things you learn is there are things that they call, what do they call them, and or, and logical connectives, I guess is what they call them. And or, and if then, and not. And these are operators in symbolic logic. And so the word and was front and center, and then they had to figure out something to say about the word but. And a couple of the books that I had said, oh, but is a synonym of and. It's just got a little flavor, some kind of a, smoky flavor to it. It's sort of like and barbecue flavored and or something. And so I believed that. I fell for that. I thought, okay, but is a synonym of and. It's just kind of this funny quality version of and. And it took me decades to overcome that prejudice because I was so influenced by the idea that all that mattered in language is things like truth and falsity. Later I came to realize that that's not what language is about. And at that point, the word but became extremely interesting to me. And I have a file at home in which I write down, unfortunately I don't have enough examples. Again, I love examples. But I have certain examples in which I see the word and or but used in a way that I think is kind of questionable or interesting, and I write them down. Often I'm writing an email or something like that, and I write and then I look at it as I look back, and I say, oh, that doesn't flow very well. This situation is not an and situation. This is a but situation. This is a member of the category but, not a member of the category and. And what am I referring to? I'm not referring to some object in the world or some action where somebody is moving their arms in some way. I'm referring to a situation in what I would call discourse space, an act of communication, an attempt to communicate ideas from my mind to somebody else's mind. And this attempt often takes place, or usually takes place, but not completely, through language. And so this chain, or this stream of symbols that is coming out of my mouth or my fingers or whatever, this it's an event that's taking place in discourse space, and so in this space there are situations, and some situations evoke the word but more appropriately, or more. The word but is more appropriate than the word and in those situations. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say, here's one that I read in a bio of a speaker who was coming to give a lecture on translation at Indiana University, and he was a translator from Japanese. And that may not seem relevant, but you'll see that I think it is. It was the first sentence in his little bio, and it said, Charles Fox was born in Arizona, but grew up in Texas. And I thought, what is this but? Why but? I mean, it's a dime a dozen to be born in one place and grow up in a different place. I mean, if it had said Charles Fox was born in Arizona but grew up in Japan, I would completely understand the reason that this situation evoked was a member of the but category. But when it was just saying he was born in Arizona, I mean, it would be like saying he was born on Dolores Street and grew up on Murata Avenue. I mean, or something, I don't know what, but born in Minneapolis but grew up in St. Paul. I mean, so what? It's not a but situation. And I think you recognize that. I mean, your laughter indicates it. And I think that we understand that these things are shaded. And I'm not, again, trying to say that some things are exactly members 100% and others are 0. There are grades and shades of membership in the but category and the and category, which is why when I'm writing, I often write the word and then go back and say, this isn't as good a member of the and category as it is of the but category, and I replace the word. These are judgment calls. These are not yes or no truth statements or truth assignments. Here's one that I wrote in an email to somebody. It said, my friend Cyril was supposed to come to my birthday but ducked out at the last moment. I didn't write but, I'm sorry, I wrote and ducked out at the last moment. And then when I went back and reread it, I thought it would be better to say but. And so I was changing the membership of the category that I was assigning this full thought to. Another example, I did these pieces over 40 years ago and I'm still very fond of them. And I changed it to but after a while. and so on. I have many, many examples of this kind of a thing. The only idea that I'm really trying to get across to you is that conjunctions are names of categories too. So let's look at some other conjunctions that are related to but. I have an example that I think you will find amusing. I find it amusing. Light waves are transverse. Nonetheless, sound waves are longitudinal. Does that sound sort of just does not compute? But could you put your, have you ever really tried to figure out what situations are evoked by nonetheless? What is the difference between nonetheless, however, but, whereas, on the other hand, by contrast, nevertheless, and so forth? Have you ever really tried to analyze it? No. Did anyone ever teach you? No. You picked it up by osmosis. So we could go through we could substitute for nonetheless and get some other sentences. Let's try this one. Light waves are transverse. However, sound waves are longitudinal. Maybe. Here's one that I think works just fine, at least to me. Light waves are transverse, but sound waves are longitudinal. Sounds good. Light waves are transverse. That being said, sound waves are longitudinal. Good line, remember it, tell that at cocktail parties, you'll get a lot of laughs. I mean, it is interesting. So, a lot of categories that one acquires or that one encounters in life are very hard to pin down. I will always remember, I'm sorry this is a foreign language example, but I'll relate it to maybe some others in English momentarily. When I was working with Emmanuel on this book, I would go to Paris every summer for a month or so, and I watched his little daughter Talia grow up. And she's now about 11. And I remember when she was about 5, she was very proud new owner of a new word. And this word was par contre. Now, it's actually not one word. It's actually 2 words. It's par contre, par and contre. But for Talia, who had only heard it spoken rapidly, mostly by her brothers and maybe her parents, and of course maybe some other little kids, but little kids her age weren't saying it. I mean, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds don't go around saying par contre very much. But, maybe she was 6, I don't remember. But the point is that all kids hear words in their environment, and when they're just beginning to pick up the flavor of it, they use it with enthusiasm, with ardor, with pizzazz. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't know if this is a member of the pizzazz category. But let me just say what it means. Par contre means something like on the other hand. So she would say something like, my brother Mika is going to do this, but I, par contre, am going to do something, this other thing. And, but she wouldn't say par contre because she didn't know that there was a final RE in it. Because when you speak quickly, you say, par contre, et moi, par contre, je vais faire, par contre. And it just has this chunk feel to it. It's just this chunk. And she was delightedly using this word. And I really noticed it. It just was in her speech all the time because she was savoring it. And I think you could make an analogy to, for example, an English speaker of English and a kid who's learning English maybe at about age 5 using a word like definitely. Something like that, and using it, peppering their speech with the word definitely. I think you would find it would sound a little bit funny because it would sound like they were trying to be a little sophisticated. And they would be trying to be sophisticated. They would be reaching just a little bit beyond the limits of their understanding, and they would misuse it in the sense of that as adults. They would misuse it. Maybe in their own sense of what it means, it would be dead on. Anyway, but gradually over time, everybody sort of comes to an agreement, more or less, as to what the situations are that properly evoke this word. I remember a long time ago, there were a couple of words in French that I think I used with the same amount of enthusiasm as Talia. If there are native speakers or non-native speakers of French, people who love the French language, you'll know what I'm talking about if I say adding the comma quoi at the end of a sentence. Quoi at the end of a sentence. What the hell does that mean? It's hard to say, but you pick it up by analogy. You sort of sense when it makes sense to put this quoi at the end. If you read Catcher in the Rye, I know that's an old novel, but it's one of my, and it's one of my favorite novels. I mean, is that a but situation? It's an old novel, but it's one of, why am I saying but? I mean, does it mean that old novels are unlikely to be good novels? You see, this is very tricky. Anyway, you'll see Holden saying, and I don't have any examples here, so I can't quote you any, but he'll say, and all over the place. And what does it mean? I don't know what it means, but I know that it's right. I can hear it. And I don't have any sense as to what it means exactly, but in discourse space, it is really, he puts it in, J.D. Salinger puts it in at the right spots. It really works, and it conveys something, but what it conveys, I don't know. Another phrase in French that I loved acquiring many years ago is just an adverb, normalement. Now you might think that just means normally in English, but it doesn't. It means something different from normally. So I have a few examples here. I don't want to go into French too much because that would throw us off. But I mean, if you say somebody is going home and you say, normalement il sera à la maison maintenant. It means sort of like, hopefully he's gotten home by now. So normalement in that sense means hopefully. Or normalement on va courir ce soir à 7 heures. And that means, it sounds like it means normally we're going to run this evening at 7. But you wouldn't say that in English. What it means is something like, unless we change our plans. Or, normalement, on devait passer 2 semaines en Bretagne. That sounds like it means normally we were supposed to spend 2 weeks in Bretagne. But it doesn't mean normally. It means if there hadn't been a hitch. And so when you catch on to this kind of a usage, which no dictionary will tell you, no native speaker will tell you, no course will tell you, nothing will tell you. You catch on to it because you hear it in the speech of people around you, and you hear the circumstances that evoke it, and the way it is used. By analogy, you start finding that you yourself are feeling it come to your mind at just the right times. And it feels very exciting. It's a marvelous moment when this phrase that you can't even define its meaning is coming to you automatically, unbidden, magically. And that's a very exciting thing. It's what was happening to Talia with par contre. She was all excited. I mean, she wasn't aware, perhaps, that she was excited about it, but she was. So these are kinds of examples. Now, I want to say that every word choice is a category and represents analogy making of the sort that I'm making. So you might get skeptical and say, well, what about the most functional words? I mean, I understand that book is a category and that even but what about the? And so I want to argue that the is the name of a category as well. And I wrote up a bunch of sentences today, and I won't spend too much time on them, but just a little bit, because I thought I was trying to show how subtle it is to know when to use the and when not to. And I hope this set of examples at least provokes you. I mean, you may not be totally convinced by what I say here, but I was having some fun with it, and so again, if you want to email me with variations on this theme, that'll be fine. So it has to do with the two phrases, go to school and go to the school. And what circumstances evoke go to school, and what circumstances evoke go to the school in the mind of a native speaker of American English. And I tried to find a bunch of examples and to show how incredibly subtle it is and how it's, again, shaded and graded. I'm not saying there's an exactly right answer in every case. But I think that we would all say it's wrong to say to a kid, you have to go to school, go to the school today. That would, I think, you would say it's wrong if you meant the ordinary meaning, go to school. You have to go to school today. So if a kid says, I have to go to school to pick up my backpack, that's a little different, because that is more the place where the school, where the backpack is, and it's not exactly going to school like to attend classes. But I think it would still be okay. Now, what if I, as the father of a child, were saying something like this? Would I say, I think I would say the, in this case. I have to go to the school to meet with the PTA members. I think I would say the there. What if it were, I were talking to my kid who was going to meet friends after school? I think I would say you have to go to school to meet your friends this afternoon. You have to go to school to meet your friends. I think I could say, of course, you have to go to the school, but I think it wouldn't be as spontaneous. You have to go to school to pick up your gym suit. If I were talking to some other parent, though, I think I would say you have to go to this school to pick up your kids' tickets. If I were talking to my kid, I would say you have to go, I think I would say you have to go to the school to buy the tickets for the musical. And then here are some more. You have to go to the school and then, oh, this one I think everybody would agree that the is needed because you're giving somebody directions. You have to go to the school and then turn left. You wouldn't say you have to go to school and then turn left. So here's another one. Again, blurry. You have to go to the school to get the parking permit? I thought you had to go to the county courthouse. Anyway, my point is not to concentrate on exactly these examples, obviously. My point is that the word the is selected by some subtle set of cognitive actions that are allowing you to understand the degree to which the word is needed in that situation for clear communication. And how its choice would, if you made the, so to speak, the wrong choice, that is the non-native speaker choice, it might confuse a native speaker. It would be pretty hard for a non-native speaker, especially my wife. Chinese is very, very distant from English. It would be very hard for her to pick up this kind of thing, this kind of subtle usage. But we all pick it up as native speakers when we're rather young. And we polish our mastery of it as we go on through life. So I'm not going to try to convince you any longer about the or articles like and so forth. I mean, I've sort of gotten the idea across. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk also about things that are kind of like interjections. So, for example, there are lots of phrases that come up in, let's say, television, comedy things, or advertising that become sort of memes, and they spread throughout the culture. So one that may not be all that current, but one that I picked up some years ago, and that I think you all know, is hello. You know, and you know what it means, right? It means something like, what are you talking about? You're off your rocker. How can you say such a dumb thing? Hello. But you have to say it with the right intonation and sort of the right sound of doubt in your voice. And when you do it, it gets across very clearly a certain kind of meaning. And there are, I keep on coming back to this idea that I want to drill into your head, which is there are hello situations. There are situations that evoke that. Those situations belong to a category. Again, it's not got, God-given boundaries that are precise. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that there are certain moments, certain situations where I could it just pops to my mind automatically without even thinking. And those are really strong members of the category. And my friend David Moser pointed out another example of this kind of thing, which I always like. It's again an intonation one. Probably, what kinds of situations evoke that probably kind of thing with that tone attached to the word? Again, it's a category. It may be a subcategory. I don't know if it is, but it might be a subcategory of situations that would evoke the word probably. I suspect it's not exactly, but in any case, it's an interesting thing. I've never been able to put my finger on it. But every once in a while I hear somebody saying it, or I myself say it, and then I try to write it down and to figure out why was that particular circumstance one that evoked that word. Okay. Now I've covered lots of linguistic examples that involve essentially choices of one word or perhaps two words. I may have used some others, I don't remember. But I want to now go on to situations that whose name, or categories whose names, they still have linguistic names, but the linguistic names are considerably longer phrases. So we have phrases, we have situations that are very naturally labeled by the label "kill two birds with one stone." I use that phrase all the time. I mean, for example, in coming out here, I could say I was going to Google and I was coming to Stanford. On this trip, I'm killing two birds with one stone. Okay, I had two visits to two different institutions out here in the Bay Area, killing two birds with one stone. So there are, you probably use it all the time yourself. And so you know how that comes to mind spontaneously. So that's a name of a category that you all have. And it's a very standard category. Proverbs sometimes all proverbs are names of categories, but some proverbs are very, very interesting, subtle, they name subtle categories. So there are lots of cases where in the last few years I've found myself saying, well, you're shutting the barn door after the horse is out. You know that phrase? I don't know if everybody knows that phrase, but it is a standard phrase. And it's evoked by certain kinds of situations. Those situations are members of the shut the horse after the barn is, shut the barn door after the horse is out situations. Once burned, twice shy. I say that quite often. So we have, let me see if I have some of the other examples of this kind of thing. Yeah, put the cart in front of the horse. Or a couple that I like are, the tail is wagging the dog. The case of the tail wagging the dog. And again, these are situations that you recognize where something that seems very small seems to be taking an inordinately large controlling role in a situation. It shouldn't be the controller, but it somehow is. And I had to explain this pretty many times and use lots of examples to Emmanuel, because in French that exact idiom or that notion doesn't exist. There isn't an idiom that corresponds to the tail wagging the dog. And so I had to give him bunches of examples before he caught on. Another example that also was similar was the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, which is something that comes about, situations in organizations where they have parts and one division of the organization isn't aware of or is doing something contradictory to another part of the organization. And so we see these situations, this phrase comes to mind, it's clearly a category. And what are we doing when we assign that situation to that category? Well, we're obviously making an analogy. Now, are we making an analogy to actually right hands and left hands knowing things? No, we're not. Right hands don't know anything and left hands don't know anything. So we can't be literally making an analogy to situations where the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. We're making analogies to other instances where we've heard the phrase used, where there may have been some canonical instance when we were 14 years old when we heard it and it struck us. And we might have savored it or delighted in it, and it registered in our mind, maybe unconsciously, but it registered in our mind, and that moment planted the seed then for a whole host of analogies that would be made later in life, and they would grow, the concept would grow and become more and more flexible until this concept, this label, could be applied to situations of many, many sorts. But it is not handed to you on a silver platter, so to speak. So you have to acquire it over time. And Emmanuel was a perfect example of this. I had to give him many examples of left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing until he sort of caught on. Now, as a last category category of categories, I guess it is a last category, but I want to talk about ones that don't really have linguistic labels, because up until now, I've just been talking about categories that either are labeled by nouns, by verbs, by conjunctions, by adverbs, or by phrases, or by, idioms, idiomatic phrases. But I'd like to come to categories that are that have no linguistic label. I mean, you can always describe them using words, but they don't have a standard linguistic label, either in general in the society or even for yourself as a private individual. They don't have labels. So in this book, and by the way, many of the ideas that I'm talking about today are in this book. In this book, we talk a lot about a particular category, which I now have a label for, but you have to understand that for years there was no label for it. Now it has become a labeled category, and I'll even give you the label right now. But it was not labeled when it first happened, of course. And that is, the label is Danny at the Grand Canyon. And this was when my son Danny was 1 year old and 3 months, and we were driving across the country to come out to California from Indiana, and we were making a tour of, my wife Carol and I were making a tour of certain national parks, and among which was the Grand Canyon. And so when we were at the edge of the Grand Canyon one afternoon, Danny was sitting cross-legged on the ground looking at ants. And I found this somewhat ironic, because here we were at the edge of this incredibly large chasm. By the way, I'll interrupt. I want to tell you something amusing. Danny is now 20, whatever he is, 25, almost 26. And he loves the wilderness, and he recently had a job in Arizona where he was working, and he was very close to the Grand Canyon, and he made sure that his friend Charles took a photograph of him sitting at the edge of the Grand Canyon looking at some ants. So I have that up in my study. But anyway, so Danny at the Grand Canyon was this odd situation of a child so young that he wouldn't have been able. I mean, if I had said, Danny, look at the Grand Canyon, it would have just been colors on his retina. He wasn't old enough to have the concept of even any distance at all, up, like a mile, even if it were, inside in a town, but let alone out in space and vertical mile and 15 miles across and 200 miles long. I mean, those concepts were not available to him. And his visual system was not built to recognize things. I mean, at that age, it was going to acquire the ability to recognize things that were very far away and to estimate distances. But at age one, nothing like that existed. And so it was perfectly sensible for him. But as his father, I found it amusing nonetheless. I mean, it was probably inappropriate of me to find it amusing, but I did. Well, it registered in my mind, but I didn't give it a name. It was just a memory. It was just a fact, something that had once happened. But then I guess it was 2005, so this would have been 16 years later, a group of us were in Egypt, and we were taking a boat down the Nile or up the Nile, whichever it might be, and we came to the Temple of Karnak, which is huge pillars, and I don't know what they're made of, but anyway, lots of huge, impressive pillars with thousands of years of history behind them. And at one point, our friend Dick, who was an adult, reached down to the ground and picked up a bottle cap. And he was making a bottle cap collection of bottle caps only in Egypt, just Egyptian bottle caps, and he saw one, and he picked it up. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, spontaneously, my memory came of Danny at the Grand Canyon. Now, obviously, this was a reminding by analogy. I mean, I don't need to spell it out, but I will a little bit. Karnak, the big towers, was the Grand Canyon, the big hole. Dick was Danny. The bottle cap was the ants. And I probably could spell out some other things as well, but I mean, it's self-evident, the basic idea of this analogy. So all at once, these two events were sort of superimposed on each other by my unconscious mind, which made it now conscious. And I wasn't aware at the time that I was creating a category, that I had begun with a singleton, which was Danny at the Grand Canyon, and had spread it out. I was just saying, it reminds me of Danny at the Grand Canyon. That's all I said. But the moment I said that, then my conscious mind started saying, oh yes, that means this is an analogy, which means the two are superimposed, which means I'm beginning to make a category, which means actually I already had a category when I had only one member. It was just a category that had one member, and now it's starting to blur out. And at this point, now this category has become an explicit category in my mind. Now it has a name, and it includes all sorts of things. It includes a mosquito biting Albert Einstein. It includes me and Emmanuel in Paris working on our book instead of going to the Louvre. Or doing all the standard tourist things that you would do in Paris. It's sort of like, what are we doing? We're paying attention to only this tiny, little teeny thing instead of enjoying the magnificent city of Paris. And on and on. And eventually it has come to mean just the idea that you focus on what you are interested in and what you're capable of focusing on. And you ignore a huge amount of stuff that other people would think of as gems. And so it's kind of become a very, very broad category now, which has the name Danny at the Grand Canyon. And so this is sort of how categories grow and how they are retrieved by analogy. And that's sort of the theme of this book, that categorization and analogy making are flip sides of the very same mental process. They're really two ways of talking about the same thing. And I'd like to finish up with just one kind of memory of myself when I was, I don't know, in my early 20s. I remember we drove around Italy, and I loved the typefaces. I will always remember my extreme love of the variety of typefaces, and for each letter of the alphabet, there were so many incredibly new, inventive ways of realizing, let's say, the letter A or the letter B or the letter Q or whatever letter you want. And I was in love with all the different, well, not the members themselves, but the very vast variety of members of the categories A through Z. I was really thrilled by that, and it's something that I still do love, and as a matter of fact, it's evidenced by the cover of this book, where you can see several A's superimposed, some of which are really very wild. The most wild one is the pink one, which belongs to a typeface called Magnificat. But my point is that since then, I have always been fascinated by categories, but I would say that today, my fascination with categories is a little bit different from my fascination back then. Now I'm fascinated by the amazing variety of categories that exist, the strange kinds of categories that we use so unconsciously, so spontaneously, many of which have labels, many of which do not. Danny at the Grand Canyon started out unlabeled and has now acquired a label. But many of our concepts, each person has their own memories that they have stocked over their lifetime and that are capable of being evoked by situations, but which don't have any labels, linguistic labels. So I just, now every culture, but I think American culture very strongly, has a tendency to, just like Talia was very excited by the new concept par contre, or par contre. She was very excited by that. Our culture as a whole is excited by the creation of new categories. It lives by the creation of new categories. And we have a long list of recent categories in the book, and I just read you a handful of them, and I think you'll see why it's fun to collect these things and to see how rich they are. Here, positive and negative feedback, vicious circle, self-fulfilling prophecy, famous for being famous, backlash, supply and demand. I'm just going to skip down here. Internet, web surfing, upload, download, video game, viral video, virtual reality, chat room, data mining. I'll skip around a little bit more here. Okay, these are funny ones. Hail Mary pass, sudden death playoff, bungee jumping, make an end run around someone, ultra marathon, pole dancing, speed dating, multitasking, brainstorming, name dropping, channel surfing, soap opera, chick flick, and soundbite, buzzword, eye candy, fast food, frequent flyer miles, wind chill factor, roller coaster, in-joke, outsource, downsize, upgrade, fractal shape, breast implant, Barbie doll, trophy wife, surrogate mother, first lady, worst case scenario. It never stops. These are all categories, and I rejoice in it, and I find it absolutely astounding, and it is what makes us different from all other animals, because other animals although they can acquire and extend their repertoire of categories, they cannot do it the way we do it, snowballing and snowballing and building and building and building and building. That is what makes us so unique. It is the way in which we continue to accrete categories to our set of categories from the moment we're born till the moment we die. And I rejoice in that, and I find it fantastic. Thank you. Now, I know some people want to leave, and that is, we should let them leave, give them a minute or so. But I was told to ask people who wish to pose questions to use one of the two microphones in the aisles so that we can get your questions recorded. So I'll just, I guess people can leave while we're taking the questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit it just to one.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the word discourse space.
Discourse space?
Yeah, because and that kind of strikes me as a mathematician. You know, in the more logical world, you have these sentences, and they're supposed to be about, say, models. And so I was wondering, you know, can you maybe expand on this idea of what, you know, a discourse space is and how these categories that you're talking about sort of more apply to the discourse space rather than just sets?
Well, let's see if I can say it I don't know if I can say it terribly well. Did you hear the question? Was the question hearable? It was really trying to define the notion of discourse space. I guess things that take place in ordinary three-dimensional space are very complex. I mean, if I said to you sachet, the verb sachet, what is a sachaying? You know, it would be, I could try to show you, you know, I don't know if I would do a good job of it, but I could recognize sachaying if I saw it reasonably well. Now, what about segue? Let's see if I can segue into this, into this thing. Segue is something that takes place in discourse space. It's a sort of a logical follow-on. It's like it's maybe there are two things that seem separate, but you're trying to connect them you're trying to establish a link between them that maybe ordinarily there wouldn't be one, but I'm trying to segue from one idea into another idea, if I can do it gracefully. Okay, so that's an element that's a thing that happens in discourse space. I would say, as I said earlier, discourse space is the space in which, the space of abstract events that are communicative events, where we're trying to communicate, to transmit some idea from ourself to somebody else. And it might even be, you don't even know who you're talking to, that it could be discourse when I'm writing a book. I'm not actually speaking to anyone, but I have a sort of an imaginary person that I'm talking to. And so the discourse is the attempt at communicating an idea, and there is this sense that I have in my head that there is a kind of flow. There is flow that makes things stick together, that you might call it logic, but it's not logic in the sense of, you know, truth preserving. It's logic in the sense that it seems to make a seamless link between certain kinds of ideas. That is, a segue does. But flow in general is trying to do that. And discourse space is the space in which those things take place. I don't know how to define it other than that. It's the space of linguistic communication. And my point was there that I think that very often people don't. What I was trying to wake people up to is just the idea that the word but is a perfect example of an event in discourse space. Choosing the word but and inserting it in is an event in discourse space, which it's the label of a situation, and it's a choice of a category. And so that's what I was trying to say. I think I haven't said anything that I didn't already say, but I don't know how to say it any other way. That's as good a job as I can do. You've said as a mathematician, and I can't connect it to mathematics, because I don't think it's a mathematical space. I might also mention, since you are a mathematician, that mathematicians, there is a theory of categories. I mean, that's an official branch of mathematics, but I don't think it has anything at all to do with what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Hi. There's a catchphrase that mostly military government officials and conservatives seem to throw into their discourse that I've been trying to figure out what category it is. It annoys me, but I'm not really sure why it annoys me so much, but it's at the end of the day. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I didn't connect it with any particular set of people. I have heard the phrase, and I do remember hearing it, and probably I've heard it spoken undoubtedly by political people, but I didn't realize that it had any, sort of association with a particular political set of people. And I haven't thought about that category, but I do appreciate the example. I think it's a very good example of one of these linguistic phrases that sounds so simple, but that what you're saying is that it actually has a lot of depth associated with it. And in this case, part of the depth is that it contains a kind of a political undertone or subtone, or I don't know what word to use, which I think is part of what you're saying, and I think that shows the subtlety of the phrase and the subtlety of the acts of analogy making that are going on in the minds of people, both who use it and who hear it. Mm-hmm. So, but I can't comment on that phrase, particularly because I never really thought about it. Yeah, over there.
Hi, I would like to hear your thoughts on highly contentious categories, / what do you think about the category of consciousness and intelligence, and for example, whether binding of consciousness has anything to do with how we make analogies and identify categories.
Consciousness, well, is that what you're asking about, consciousness? And you mentioned intelligence also. Well, in my book in 2007 called I'm a Strange Loop, I have a whole dialogue called, I don't remember what it's called exactly, but something like consciousness equals thinking. And there I try to argue for that idea that thinking and consciousness are the same thing. And intelligence, not all thinking is highly intelligent, but I like to think that if you want me to try to define intelligence, if that's what you're looking for, I have a definition which Emmanuel and I put into this book. My definition for intelligence is, it's closely related to what I said today in a certain sense. That is, it is the ability to put one's finger on the essence of a situation rapidly. And that means to categorize rapidly, to make analogies rapidly, to find compelling or strong analogies rapidly. That's my notion of intelligence. And that's, let's say, high-quality thinking. But thinking in general might be the same thing. It's just maybe the retrieval of the categories isn't quite as efficient or isn't quite as on target. But it is still the same mechanism, and I claim that is indistinguishable from consciousness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've started to notice recently that new technological media have enabled, it seems to me, a faster rate of creation of new concepts. A good example is the internet, on which, or should I say internet, on which...
I missed that. What was
internet versus internet. Never mind.
I-N-N-E-R? Is that what
internet. The T is often elided.
I see. Internet.
Yes. Anyway, on the internet, people have started saying things such as, I skipped class today because Douglas Hofstadter lecture.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, what do you think it is about these media in which maybe it has something to do with like the fact that we're writing things down that are not intended to be spoken, but then they become spoken at some point?
Okay, I have another example which I'll give you. This is interesting. I mean, you know, what do they call them? The emoticons. And at first I really thought they were dumb and I didn't use them. But by God, I use them. No, I only use two types. Well, maybe even more. But basically... I use the colon followed by the right paren. I use the semicolon followed by the right paren. But they're not names of the same category. They are definitely not names of the same category. And I use a colon followed by a left parenthesis. And maybe I use one or two others. I don't know. And so these are examples of modern memes that the web or the internet, you know, various kinds of media have brought into existence. And the one that you mentioned, I guess, because, used as a shortened form of because of, sort of, is that it? Yeah, I mean, I can see that this is evolving, this is happening. I'm not a party to that. I actually go the other way. Whenever I do, you know, when I type a thing, I don't use two thumbs, I use one finger, and I never use any abbreviations. I make a point of not using abbreviations, and so, except that the two dots in the thing, that's sort of an abbreviation, but it's become its own thing. But I see it happening all the time. I agree with you. You're probably right, that there is pressure, there's lots of pressure to create new categories and to sort of make communication more efficient. Absolutely. I mean, that's the nature of communication these days. It probably always was, but it's certainly very intense. I agree with you. Yeah.
You point out how new categories enrich language, but language also is being corrupted, at least formal English is being corrupted.
Oh,
For
yeah.
instance, it is I sounds bizarre these days. So what does one do? Does one go with the flow, or does one try and fight?
Well, your question is a very good one, because, I mean, I happen to be a member of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. I get questionnaires from them about once a year. They ask me about 50 questions, and they say, do you approve of this? Fully, you know, in formal writing, or in colloquial, or disapprove, or highly disapprove. And it's interesting. I have very strong opinions, and I fully agree with you. I'm not one of those people who think that we should just be descriptive. I believe in prescriptive, the idea that there is a correct way to spell something. And I think most of us do fundamentally. I mean, if you look in the New York Times, you will find that all the words are spelled correctly. And if a word is spelled incorrectly, they might catch and put an erratum in, you know, some other time. I mean, there is a sense that it's not just anything goes. However, to my chagrin, in school, as far as I can tell, no grammar is taught. I mean, when I was a kid, we learned subject and object and direct object and indirect object and present perfect and past perfect and so forth and so on. We learned the names of all sorts of things. And I don't think that my kids, who are now out of high school or out of college, but I don't think that they ever learned what a subject or an object was, or a verb, even, well, maybe a verb. Maybe they know what a noun and a verb is. I mean, probably they do, but that's because I told them, not because, you know, and it is very disturbing to me. And I fully agree with you. I'm in your camp, but I don't know how to do it other than to be try to be an example and write books that sound fairly literate, and to use language well, and to encourage the use of good language. I'm teaching a course next semester called Writing Structured Verse, and I'm going to, be very strict with my students about how they use language, and I'm going to talk about their word choices very carefully. But that's, a handful of people. How do you affect the entire world? I don't know. But anyway, I agree fully with you. Yeah.
Inspired by your terrific lecture today, we've had a discourse just recently at a fairly high level of sophistication. Do you think computer systems will ever be capable of handling that kind of discourse? There might be a little robot over in the corner who's listening to your lecture and lumbers up to this microphone like me and asks you a coherent question and is capable of responding to your answer. Is that ever going to happen? Are there some barrier to that?
I don't claim to know the answer to that question. I have thought about it a great deal, and the idea that it might happen quickly within the next 50 years or something like that, as advocated by people like Ray Kurzweil and others. First of all, I think it's not likely, it's implausible. But secondly, it disturbs me. It bothers me. On the other hand, I can see no reason that it is impossible. And I even, at one time, even in a certain sense, kind of bought into the line of Hans Moravec, who is very similar to Ray Kurzweil, when he wrote a book. I don't remember whether it was his book Mind Children or another book, but it doesn't matter. He has this idea that we collectively are going to give rise to machines that will be more intelligent and more creative and more empathetic, hopefully, than we are. And he says, what could be nobler? What role could we play that would be more noble than that? To give rise to what he calls mind children. And as long as it's way off in the future, beyond my horizon, it's okay with me. But if it starts to seem like, my own kids are going to be sort of, outmoded, obsolete, it frightens me, and it really disturbs me. But I don't see why it wouldn't be possible for that to happen.
Along those lines, have you seen the movie Her?
No, I've heard about it. I have not seen it. Now, I must admit that I was told that we're supposed to stop at 6:30. I will take, let me be nice if I can and take 2 more questions, okay? Just one here and one there, all right? And then we'll try to...
I have kind of a big category of questions, but I'll keep them. Can you talk about the sort of semantic drift of categories over time, / sorry.
Was that accidental?
No, it's sort of, maybe a little bit. It came up, but I figured I'd go with it. The other part of that is the difference between, if there is any such thing, Platonic categories versus the category that any particular person or set of people has in their mind at any given time.
Well, yeah, each of us is, we house in our minds many, many categories like name dropping and brainstorming and vicious circle and stuff that our culture gives us. And all these other things, bait and switch and tail wagging the dog, not to mention par contre and so forth. We all have lots of those, they're given those. But then we all have our own private repertoire of categories. Like I had the category, without even knowing that it was a category, of Danny at the Grand Canyon, which then became sort of more recognized when Dick reached down to pick up the bottle cap, and it started to become very clear. But I have, millions of memories in my mind that are evocable or let me find a different word, triggerable, retrievable, excitable, I don't know what the word is, but where a new event happens and it reminds me of that old event, and those two are then sort of superimposed. So I have my own personal set of categories that is unique to me. I mean, I remember, here's an example, I remember I was in some airport, probably in, I think it was Charlotte, and I was waiting for a plane, and I was sitting around in the waiting area, and a mouse started running around, and people saw it. And some guy got up with cowboy boots and started running around trying to stomp on the mouse. And it was an unforgettable scene of this guy running around the thing. You know, that's a personal memory that I have. Now, you don't have it, but I've just conveyed it to you. But I mean, each of us has memories of weird events that are unique and that, you know, they're our own private category repertoire, and we're made of that combination of social or public categories and private categories. Does that answer your
Answer the
question?
second question, yeah.
What?
Answer the second question.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last.
So, in speaking of proverbs as categories, I thought of two movies that show what I can only think must also be a category in real life, which is that good people know proverbs, or people who don't know proverbs are somehow untrustworthy. So there's the movie Amélie, where Amélie's friend goes on a walk with her new boyfriend and starts asking him all these proverbs in French, and he's able to explain or say...
I dimly remember that. I saw the movie a few months ago. I thought it was very funny, and I sort of remember that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's one. And she says for her, it's a proverb that you trust somebody who knows their proverbs, or don't trust somebody who doesn't.
Oh.
The other I can think of is The Thin Blue Line, which is Errol Morris film, somebody who is wrongfully imprisoned for murder, and the rural county sheriff is asking the innocent man all these proverbs, and asking him, and the guy understands what they were, and it seemed to me, although never explicitly said, that this county sheriff had a rule of thumb, which is, well, if he can understand these proverbs, he can't be the crazy person who committed this murder that was depicted in the movie. And that, along with the 2 questions ago about computers and conversation, there's a certain type of thinking that you have described artificial intelligence is going in today, which doesn't seem to be the same as the type of creativity by analogy learning or thinking that you've been talking
Well, I agree that artificial intelligence today is not very close to anything like that. But it's interesting. It's an interesting notion that knowing proverbs makes you into I don't know what, it doesn't seem a moral person, but I don't know, makes you more reliable or trustworthy or something. I wouldn't think that's the case, but I would think that knowing how to apply proverbs, that is, understanding proverbs and using them fluently, it is true that I'm impressed when people do that. I think it's charming, and it shows a certain kind of conceptual depth that pleases me. If somebody says in a situation where they're avoiding something that once caused them some trouble, they say once burned, twice shy, there's something I like about it. It makes me feel good. So I can relate to that. And I like the ability to go back to the history of the language and kind of draw on wisdom from the past and use it in current situations. I think that's very good, and it shows that you're not just a person of the moment, but you're a person that is a little bit more rooted in the past. And I think that's good, but I don't think it makes you more moral.
Have you met a person who does not understand a proverb other than a non-native speaker?
Well, I've read that often very autistic people may not. I don't know if that's true, but I've read that. Who knows? I heard a complaint out there, so I don't know. I just heard that. Yeah, even though the questions are over, but yeah.
It may not be the issue of somebody knowing a proverb; it's somebody knowing your proverb. It's the way that you categorize the people as people similar to you.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. If people are like me, I guess the more they're like me, the more I tend to trust them. That's probably true. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thanks Professor Hofstadter for a very stimulating lecture. This is actually his second appearance as a symbolic system distinguished speaker. He was here in 1992. And I really think we should have you back more often.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's 22 years from now. I'll be getting up there.
Anyway, think